The sun hung mercilessly over the Colorado plains as Eleanor Thorne's wagon wheel snapped with a sickening crack, pitching the vehicle at a dangerous angle and sending her precious cargo of medical supplies sliding across the wooden floorboards. It was June of 1878, and Eleanor, a 23-year-old nurse from Boston, was beginning to think her journey to Montrose had been a terrible mistake. Eleanor wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of dirt across her forehead as she surveyed the damage. The wheel had completely shattered, leaving her stranded on the lonely trail just as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. She had been told the journey would be difficult, but nothing had prepared her for this desolation, this isolation that seemed to swallow her whole. "Easy there," she murmured to her agitated horse, a chestnut mare named Penny who sensed the coming danger before Eleanor did. The horse's ears flicked nervously, and she pawed at the ground, her muscles tense and ready to bolt. It was only when Penny whinnied in distress that Eleanor heard a low, rumbling growl from the tall grass beyond the trail. Her heart stammered in her chest as she slowly turned, her blue eyes widening at the sight of a lean, gray wolf emerging from the brush, its amber eyes locked on her with predatory intent. Eleanor swallowed hard, backing slowly toward her wagon. Her father's hunting rifle was tucked beneath the driver's seat, but the thought of using it made her hands tremble. She had never fired it at anything living before. The wolf was soon joined by another, and then another, until a pack of 5 encircled the broken wagon. They moved with calculated precision, testing the air with their noses, communicating with subtle ear movements and tail positions. Eleanor knew with sinking certainty that they were sizing her up, deciding if she was worth the risk. Penny strained against her harness, nearly frantic now. Eleanor reached the wagon and fumbled beneath the seat, her fingers finally closing around the cool metal of the rifle. She pulled it out, hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. "Go away," she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. "Leave us alone." The wolves seemed unimpressed by her command. The largest of them, the alpha, Eleanor presumed took a deliberate step closer, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Eleanor raised the rifle, but her inexperience was painfully evident as she struggled to cock it properly. The wolves sensed her weakness. They began to close the circle, padding silently through the tall grass. Eleanor felt tears stinging her eyes. She had come west to escape the suffocating propriety of Boston society, to make something meaningful of her life by bringing medical care to a frontier town in need. Now it seemed she would die here, alone on the trail, torn apart by wolves before she even reached Montrose. The crack of gunfire split the air. Eleanor flinched, certain for a moment that she had accidentally fired the rifle. But no, the sound had come from beyond the circle of wolves. A second shot followed, and one of the wolves yelped, darting back into the grass. The rest of the pack hesitated, their heads swiveling toward the source of the disturbance. A third shot, this one deliberately aimed at the ground near the alpha, sent dirt spraying into the air. The wolves broke formation, slinking back into the tall grass and disappearing into the gathering dusk. "You all right, madam?" The voice was deep, with the distinctive drawl of a man who had spent his life under western skies. Eleanor turned toward the sound, clutching the rifle to her chest like a lifeline. A rider approached on a powerful black stallion, the dying sunlight glinting off the star-shaped badge pinned to his vest. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat brim, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes that seemed to assess her and the situation in a single glance. Yes," Eleanor managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you for your timely intervention, sir." The man dismounted with fluid grace, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. As he stepped into better light, Eleanor got her first clear look at her rescuer. He was tall, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of a life lived outdoors. His eyes were a striking blue, contrasting sharply with his dark hair and the trail dust that seemed to have settled into every crease of his clothing. "Those wolves have been troubling travelers for weeks now," he said, holstering his pistol. "Name's Finn Newbury. I serve as sheriff in Montrose." "Eleanor Thorne," she replied, lowering the rifle now that the immediate danger had passed. "I'm the nurse that Dr. Sullivan sent for." Something flickered across Finn's face, surprise, perhaps, or skepticism. "You're traveling alone, Miss Thorne." Eleanor lifted her chin, a gesture her mother always said made her look stubborn. "I am quite capable, Sheriff Newbury, or I was, until this wretched wheel decided to betray me." She gestured to the broken wagon with obvious frustration. Finn's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "I don't doubt your capability, Miss Thorne, just your judgment in traveling these parts without an escort." He moved past her to examine the damaged wheel, crouching down to run his fingers along the splintered wood. "This is beyond repair. You'll need a new wheel entirely." Eleanor sighed, pushing a strand of auburn hair that had escaped her practical bun. "I don't suppose there's a wheelwright hiding in those trees." Finn actually smiled then, a brief flash of white teeth against his tanned face. "Not for another 15 miles. But Montrose is only about 5 miles ahead. I can take you there, and we can send someone back for your wagon and supplies tomorrow." Eleanor hesitated, looking at her scattered medical supplies and personal belongings. "I can't just leave everything here." "The wolves will be back after dark," Finn said bluntly. "And they won't be the only predators. Mountain lions prowl these hills too." As if to emphasize his point, a distant howl echoed across the plains, raising gooseflesh on Eleanor's arms. She glanced at Penny, who was still agitated, and then at the darkening sky. "Very well," she conceded, "but I need my medical bag at least, and there's a trunk with personal items I'd rather not leave behind." Finn nodded, all business now. "We can secure the trunk to my saddle. Diablo's strong enough to carry it." He patted his horse's muscular neck. "You'll ride with me. We can be in town before full dark if we move quickly." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at the thought of riding pressed against this stranger, but her practical nature prevailed. She nodded and moved to collect her medical bag, a leather satchel containing instruments and medicines that had cost her nearly all her savings. As she gathered her most essential belongings, Finn secured the wagon as best he could, unhitching Penny and tying her to Diablo's saddle. He worked efficiently, with the confidence of a man accustomed to handling emergencies. "I appreciate your assistance, Sheriff," Eleanor said as she handed him her trunk. "I confess I underestimated the dangers of this journey." Finn secured the trunk with practiced ease. "The West isn't forgiving to those who underestimate it, Miss Thorne, but you showed good sense having a weapon, even if you're not familiar with using it." "My father insisted," Eleanor admitted, "though he would likely be horrified to know I nearly had to use it." Finn mounted Diablo first, then extended his hand to help Eleanor up. She hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his much larger one, surprised at the gentle strength with which he pulled her up behind him. "You'll want to hold on," he advised, glancing over his shoulder. "The trail gets rough in places." Eleanor tentatively placed her hands on his waist, acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation. In Boston, simply riding alone with a man would be enough to ruin her reputation. Here, it seemed such concerns were secondary to survival. As they set off toward Montrose, Penny following obediently behind, Eleanor found herself wondering what other conventions she would need to abandon in this new life. The West was already proving to be far more challenging and far less romantic than the dime novels had led her to believe. The sun had fully set by the time they crested the final hill, revealing the lights of Montrose twinkling in the valley below. Eleanor had long since given up maintaining a proper distance from Sheriff Newbury. The rough terrain had forced her to wrap her arms more securely around his waist, and she was grateful for his solid presence as Diablo navigated the steep trail. "That's Montrose," Finn said, slowing Diablo to let Eleanor take in the view. "Not much to look at compared to Boston, I expect, but it's home." From this distance, Montrose appeared as a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street, with smaller dwellings scattered around the perimeter. A church steeple stood taller than the other structures, and Eleanor could make out the flicker of lantern light through various windows. "It's exactly what I hoped for," Eleanor said truthfully. After the stifling confines of Boston society, the open expanse of the western town felt like a breath of fresh air, despite the ordeal she had just survived. Finn made a noncommittal sound, nudging Diablo forward. As they descended into the town proper, Eleanor became aware of curious gazes following their progress. A woman riding behind the sheriff, her hair coming loose from its pins and her dress covered in trail dust, was evidently a sight worth noting. They stopped in front of a two-story building with Montrose Hotel painted in fading letters across its facade. A few men seated on the porch watched with open interest as Finn dismounted and helped Eleanor down. "Mrs. Harrison runs the hotel," Finn explained, lifting Eleanor's trunk from his saddle. "She's expecting you. Dr. Sullivan arranged a room for you until more permanent accommodations can be found." Eleanor smoothed her skirts self-consciously, aware of how disheveled she must appear. "Thank you again, Sheriff. I'm not sure what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Finn's expression was unreadable in the dim light from the hotel windows. "Just doing my job, Miss Thorne. I'll check on you tomorrow, see how you're settling in. And I'll arrange for your wagon to be retrieved." Before Eleanor could respond, the hotel door swung open, revealing a stout woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Lord above, Sheriff, you bringing in strays again." The woman's tone was gruff but not unkind as she surveyed Eleanor. "This is Miss Thorne, Mrs. Harrison. The nurse Dr. Sullivan's been waiting for," Finn explained. "Had some trouble on the trail. Her wagon broke down and she had a run-in with that wolf pack." Mrs. Harrison's eyes widened. "Mercy. Come in, child, come in. You must be half dead with fright and fatigue." She ushered Eleanor toward the door, taking charge with the efficiency of a woman who had seen it all. Eleanor glanced back at Finn, who tipped his hat in a silent farewell before leading both horses toward what she presumed was the town livery. "He's a good man, our sheriff," Mrs. Harrison remarked, following Eleanor's gaze. "Keeps to himself mostly, but always there when folks need him. Now, let's get you cleaned up and fed. You can tell me all about your adventure over a hot meal." As Eleanor was led into the warm interior of the hotel, she found herself wondering about the reserved sheriff who had saved her life. There was a story there, she was certain, a depth of character behind those vigilant blue eyes. But that was a mystery for another day. Tonight, she was simply grateful to be alive and safely arrived in the town that would become her new home. The following morning, Eleanor awoke to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town coming to life, the clatter of wagon wheels on packed dirt, the distant lowing of cattle, voices calling greetings across the street. She lay for a moment in the narrow bed, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeam that streamed through the simple muslin curtains. Her muscles protested as she sat up, unaccustomed to the rigors of trail travel and yesterday's unexpected adventure. After washing quickly in the basin of cool water provided, Eleanor dressed in one of her plainer work dresses, a practical navy blue with minimal trim, and twisted her hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. The hotel's dining room was nearly empty when she descended the stairs, the early risers having already departed for their day's work. Mrs. Harrison appeared from the kitchen, carrying a pot of coffee. "Good morning, Miss Thorne. Slept well, I hope." The older woman poured coffee into a waiting cup without waiting for a response. "You must be famished. I'll bring you some breakfast straight away." "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. I am rather hungry," Eleanor admitted, taking a sip of the strong coffee and trying not to grimace. It was far more robust than the delicate blend her mother served at home. "Sheriff Newbury came by earlier," Mrs. Harrison said, setting down a plate of eggs and biscuits. "Said to tell you he's arranged for the blacksmith's boy to fetch your wagon. Should be back by midday, God willing and the wolves permitting." Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment at having missed him. "That's very kind of him." Mrs. Harrison's knowing smile suggested she read more into Eleanor's response than was intended. "He mentioned he'd escort you to Dr. Sullivan's office once you're ready. Said he'd be at the sheriff's office whenever you want to head over." Eleanor ate quickly, eager to meet the doctor who had hired her based solely on a written exchange of letters and her credentials from the Boston Medical College nursing program. Dr. Sullivan had seemed progressive in his correspondence, expressing admiration for her training and enthusiasm for bringing modern medical practices to Montrose. After finishing her meal and thanking Mrs. Harrison, Eleanor collected her medical bag and stepped out onto Montrose's main street for the first time. The morning sun illuminated a town that was both exactly what she had expected and somehow completely different. The buildings were predominantly wooden, with false fronts giving the business district an air of aspiration beyond its frontier reality. Horses and wagons moved up and down the street, creating a constant cloud of dust that settled on everything. People went about their business, shopkeepers sweeping their porches, women carrying baskets of goods, men gathering in small groups to discuss the day's concerns. Eleanor was acutely aware of the curious glances cast her way as she walked toward the building marked Sheriff in bold letters. News of her dramatic arrival had clearly spread, and newcomers were rare enough to warrant attention in a town this size. The sheriff's office was cool and dim after the bright sunlight outside. Finn sat behind a desk piled with wanted posters and paperwork, his hat hung on a peg behind him. He looked up as she entered, and Eleanor was struck again by the intensity of his blue eyes. "Miss Thorne," he said, rising from his chair. "Hope you're recovered from yesterday's excitement." "Quite recovered, thank you," Eleanor replied. "Mrs. Harrison said you arranged for my wagon to be retrieved. I'm most grateful." Finn nodded, reaching for his hat. "Least I could do. Doc Sullivan's been counting the days until your arrival. The town's been without proper nursing care since Mrs. Littlefield passed last winter." As they stepped back onto the street, Eleanor noticed Finn's subtle positioning, keeping himself between her and the passing traffic, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. It was the vigilance of a man who had learned the hard way that danger rarely announced itself. "How long have you been sheriff here, Mr. Newbury?" she asked as they walked. "Going on 5 years," he replied. "Came to Colorado after the war, worked cattle for a spell, then took the badge when the previous sheriff decided mining in Nevada sounded more profitable." Eleanor did the mental arithmetic. If Finn had fought in the war between the states, he had to be in his mid-30s at least. The lines around his eyes and the occasional gray strand in his dark hair supported this estimate. "And you? What brings a Boston-educated nurse all the way to Montrose?" Finn asked, glancing sideways at her. Eleanor considered her answer carefully. The full truth that she was fleeing an arranged marriage to a man 30 years her senior, that she had defied her family's expectations by pursuing nursing rather than a suitable match, seemed too personal to share with someone she barely knew. "I wanted to put my training to use where it's truly needed," she said instead. "Boston has more doctors and nurses than it knows what to do with. Out here, I thought I might make a real difference." Finn's expression suggested he suspected there was more to the story, but he didn't press. "Well, you'll certainly have that opportunity. Doc Sullivan's territory covers half the county, and he's not as young as he used to be." They stopped in front of a modest building with Dr. H. Sullivan, physician and surgeon, painted on the window. Before Finn could knock, the door swung open to reveal a tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and spectacles perched on a prominent nose. "Sheriff, and this must be Miss Thorne," the man exclaimed, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "I'd begun to worry you'd changed your mind about our little town." "Dr. Sullivan, I presume," Eleanor said, extending her hand. "I apologize for the delay. There was an incident with my wagon yesterday, but Sheriff Newbury came to my rescue." Dr. Sullivan clasped her hand warmly. "Yes, I heard all about it. News travels faster than telegraph wire in Montrose. Come in, come in. Sheriff, you'll join us for coffee." Finn shook his head. "Got rounds to make, Doc. Just wanted to see Miss Thorne safely delivered." Dr. Sullivan nodded understandingly. "Another time, then." "Miss Thorne, please come in. I'm eager to show you our humble facilities." Eleanor turned to Finn. "Thank you again, Sheriff Newbury, for everything." Something softened briefly in Finn's expression. "Welcome to Montrose, Miss Thorne." With a tip of his hat, he turned and walked back toward his office, his spurs jingling with each step. The interior of Dr. Sullivan's office was surprisingly well appointed, with modern medical equipment that must have cost a small fortune to transport to this remote location. A waiting area led to an examination room, and stairs presumably led to living quarters above. "I've been practicing medicine for 37 years, Miss Thorne," Dr. Sullivan explained as he showed her around. "Started as an army surgeon during the Mexican War, then set up practice here when the town was nothing more than a trading post. I've delivered most of the children in this county and patched up more gunshot wounds and broken bones than I care to remember." Eleanor examined the instruments displayed in a glass-fronted cabinet. "Your equipment is impressive, Doctor. I wasn't expecting such modern tools so far from the cities." Dr. Sullivan beamed with pride. "I believe frontier folk deserve the same quality of care as city dwellers. That's why I was so pleased when you responded to my advertisement. Your training at the Boston Medical College speaks volumes about your capabilities." He led her to a small desk in the corner of the room. "This will be your workspace. I've arranged temporary lodging for you with Mrs. Harrison until we can find something more permanent. Now, shall we discuss your duties?" The next hour passed in detailed conversation about the medical needs of Montrose and the surrounding area. Dr. Sullivan was refreshingly forward-thinking, valuing Eleanor's input and acknowledging her expertise in areas like wound care and childhood diseases. "I should warn you," he said eventually, his expression becoming serious. "Not everyone here will immediately accept a female medical professional. Some of the old-timers, particularly, might be skeptical of your abilities." Eleanor smiled wryly. "I faced similar skepticism in Boston, Doctor. I'm quite accustomed to proving my worth through actions rather than words." Dr. Sullivan chuckled. "I believe you'll do just fine, Miss Thorne. Now, let's take a walk down to the apothecary. Mr. Peterson should have the supplies I ordered for your arrival." As they stepped outside, Eleanor noticed a commotion at the far end of the street. A wagon was being pulled into town. Her wagon, she realized with relief, but something was clearly amiss. A crowd had gathered and she could hear raised voices. "What on earth?" Dr. Sullivan murmured, squinting in that direction. Without waiting for him, Eleanor picked up her skirts and hurried toward the disturbance. As she drew closer, she could see Sheriff Newbury standing beside her damaged wagon, his posture tense as he faced off against a red-faced man in dirty buckskins. "Those are my supplies." The man was shouting, gesturing wildly at Eleanor's wagon. "Found 'em fair and square. You found an abandoned wagon that doesn't belong to you, Harlan," Finn replied, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "That's called theft in these parts, Sheriff." Eleanor called as she approached. Both men turned to look at her, along with the crowd of onlookers. "Miss Thorne," Finn acknowledged with a nod. "This gentleman claims he discovered your wagon this morning and was bringing it to town as a public service." The sarcasm in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. The man called Harlan spat on the ground, his bloodshot eyes fixing on Eleanor with undisguised hostility. "Didn't know it belonged to no woman," he muttered. "Just saw a broken-down wagon with supplies." "Finders keepers. That's the law of the frontier." "Not in my jurisdiction, it isn't," Finn said firmly. "Now, you want to hand over anything you might have already found from this wagon, or do you want to discuss it further from inside a cell?" Harlan glared at Finn, then at Eleanor, before reaching reluctantly into his coat and pulling out several small bottles medicines from Eleanor's supplies. He dropped them into Finn's outstretched hand with poor grace. "Anything else?" Finn pressed, his gaze unwavering. With a string of colorful curses, Harlan produced a few more items: a silver-backed hairbrush that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother, a small pouch of coins, and a framed daguerreotype of Eleanor's parents. "That's all," he growled. "Ain't worth the trouble anyway." Finn handed the recovered items to Eleanor. "I suggest you move along, Harlan. Your welcome in Montrose gets shorter every time I see you." The man slunk away, muttering under his breath. The crowd, deprived of further entertainment, began to disperse. "Your wagon's in rough shape," Finn observed, turning his attention to the damaged vehicle. "Jacob can probably fix the wheel, but it'll take a few days." Eleanor clutched her recovered possessions, fighting unexpected tears of relief at having her precious mementos returned. "Thank you for intervening, Sheriff. Again." Finn's expression softened slightly. "Just doing my job, Miss Thorne." He hesitated, then added, "Though I'm starting to think keeping you out of trouble might become a full-time occupation." The hint of teasing in his voice caught Eleanor by surprise. She found herself smiling in response. "I assure you, Sheriff, I don't make a habit of attracting calamity. I've lived a perfectly uneventful life until yesterday." "Somehow I doubt that," Finn replied, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of genuine amusement in his eyes before his professional demeanor returned. "I'll have your belongings delivered to the hotel once we unload the wagon." Dr. Sullivan, who had caught up to Eleanor, clapped his hands together. "Excellent. Crisis averted. Now, Miss Thorne, shall we continue to the apothecary?" Eleanor nodded, but her attention lingered on Finn as he began directing the unloading of her wagon. There was something compelling about the quiet sheriff, a depth of character that intrigued her despite her determination to focus solely on establishing herself professionally in Montrose. As if sensing her gaze, Finn looked up, their eyes meeting briefly across the dusty street. Eleanor quickly turned away, falling into step beside Dr. Sullivan, telling herself firmly that romantic entanglements were the last thing she needed as she embarked on this new chapter of her life. Yet she couldn't quite ignore the warmth that spread through her chest. or the way her pulse had quickened under the sheriff's steady gaze. The first weeks in Montrose passed in a blur of activity as Eleanor established herself in her new role. To her relief, most townsfolk quickly overcame their initial skepticism about a female medical professional once they witnessed her competence. Dr. Sullivan gave her increasing responsibility, allowing her to handle minor cases independently while he focused on more complex medical issues. Eleanor's days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were spent at the clinic. Afternoons often involved house calls to patients too ill to travel, and evenings were her own, typically devoted to reading medical journals or writing lengthy letters to her younger sister back in Boston, the only family member who had supported her decision to head west. Her paths crossed frequently with Sheriff Newbury's, though their interactions remained largely professional. He would tip his hat when they passed on the street, occasionally stop by the clinic to check on a prisoner he'd brought in with injuries, or exchange brief pleasantries when they encountered each other at the hotel dining room, where Eleanor still resided while seeking permanent housing. Yet Eleanor found herself inexplicably aware of his presence whenever he was nearby, a fact she attributed to gratitude rather than any deeper interest. Finn Newbury was, after all, not the type of man she had ever envisioned for herself. He was as different from Boston's polished gentleman as the rugged Colorado mountains were from the manicured gardens of Beacon Hill. It was during her third week in Montrose that their carefully maintained distance was bridged by unexpected circumstances. Eleanor had just finished treating a young boy with a broken arm when Mrs. Harrison bustled into the clinic, her normally composed face flushed with excitement. "Miss Thorne, you're needed urgently at the sheriff's office," the older woman announced, slightly out of breath. "Sheriff's been hurt in some altercation at the saloon. Sounds bad from what young Billy Evans was saying." Eleanor's heart stuttered, but her professional training took over immediately. "Doctor Sullivan is out at the Peterson farm delivering a baby," she said, already gathering supplies into her medical bag. "Did Billy say what kind of injury?" "Something about a knife," Mrs. Harrison replied, wringing her hands. "Sheriff broke up a fight and got slashed for his troubles." Eleanor moved with practiced efficiency, selecting bandages, catgut sutures, carbolic acid for cleaning the wound, and a vial of morphine for pain management. "I'll go immediately. Thank you for bringing word, Mrs. Harrison." The short walk to the sheriff's office seemed interminable. Eleanor forced herself to maintain a dignified pace, despite the urge to run, reminding herself that knife wounds often looked worse than they were, that Finn was strong and healthy, that panic would serve no one. She found the sheriff's office door ajar and pushed it open to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Finn sat in his desk chair, his face alarmingly pale beneath his tan, pressing a bloodied cloth to his left forearm. Deputy Morris hovered nearby, looking young and terrified, while the town blacksmith, Mr. Davis, kept a firm grip on a struggling, cursing man whose hands were cuffed behind his back. "Miss Thorne," Finn acknowledged, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his eyes. "Wasn't necessary to trouble you. I could have made it to the clinic." "Nonsense," Eleanor replied briskly, setting down her bag and moving directly to his side. "Let me see the wound." Finn hesitated, then removed the cloth. Eleanor suppressed a wince at the sight of the jagged gash running from his wrist, almost to his elbow. It was deep enough to require stitches, but hadn't hit any major blood vessels, judging by the moderate bleeding. "Deputy Morris, I need clean water and as much light as you can provide," she instructed, already opening her medical bag. "Mr. Davis, perhaps you could secure your prisoner elsewhere. Sheriff Newbury needs quiet and clean air." Both men jumped to obey, the deputy fetching water while the blacksmith dragged the still protesting prisoner to the cells at the back of the building. "This will need stitching," Eleanor told Finn as she gently cleaned the wound with carbolic solution. "And you've lost enough blood that you should remain seated. I can administer morphine for the pain." Finn shook his head. "No morphine. Need to keep my wits about me. That's Turner in the cell back there, and his friends might come looking for him." Eleanor frowned. "This will be quite painful without something for the pain, Sheriff." A ghost of a smile touched Finn's lips. "Not my first knife wound, Miss Thorne. I'll manage." There was something in his tone, not bravado, but a simple statement of fact that spoke of experiences Eleanor could only imagine. She nodded, respecting his decision even as she disapproved from a medical standpoint. "Very well. Hold still, please." Eleanor worked with focused precision, her hands steady as she closed the wound with neat stitches. Finn remained stoically silent throughout the procedure, though she could feel the tension in his muscles and saw the tightening around his eyes when the pain was particularly sharp. "You've had medical training beyond nursing," Finn observed as she tied off the final suture. It wasn't a question. Eleanor glanced up, surprised. "How did you know?" "Your technique. Too practiced for someone who just assists." His blue eyes studied her with newfound curiosity. Eleanor hesitated before answering. "I attended lectures with the medical students whenever possible. The professors didn't approve, but several of the students shared their notes and allowed me to practice procedures." She began bandaging his arm with clean linen strips. "Women aren't permitted to become doctors in most medical schools, but that didn't stop me from learning." Finn nodded thoughtfully. "Explains why Doc Sullivan trusts you with so much responsibility." "He's been remarkably accepting of my capabilities," Eleanor agreed, securing the bandage. "Many male physicians find it threatening to acknowledge that a woman might have medical skill." "Fools, then," Finn said simply. The straightforward comment, delivered without artifice, warmed Eleanor unexpectedly. She busied herself with packing away her supplies to hide the flush she felt rising to her cheeks. "You'll need to keep this clean and dry," she instructed, falling back on professional detachment. "I can change the bandage tomorrow at the clinic. No strenuous use of that arm for at least a week, preferably 2. Finn looked as though he might protest, but seemed to think better of it. "I appreciate your help, Miss Thorne." "I'm simply doing my job, Sheriff," Eleanor replied, echoing his own words from their first meeting with a small smile. "Though I hope this doesn't become a regular occurrence." Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the connection forming despite their different backgrounds and circumstances. The moment was broken by Deputy Morris returning with fresh water and additional lamps. Eleanor stepped back, resuming her professional demeanor as she gave the young deputy instructions for monitoring the sheriff's condition overnight. "I'll look in on you tomorrow," she told Finn as she prepared to leave. "Send for me immediately if there's fever or increased pain." Finn nodded, still watching her with that thoughtful expression that made her feel somehow exposed, as if he could see past her carefully constructed composure to the woman beneath. "Good evening, Sheriff," she said, suddenly eager to escape the intensity of his gaze. "Miss Thorne," he acknowledged with a slight nod that turned into a wince as the movement pulled at his injured arm. Eleanor paused at the door, looking back at the strong, capable man temporarily rendered vulnerable. "For what it's worth, Sheriff, breaking up fights isn't normally part of a physician's duties. Perhaps we're both guilty of exceeding our professional boundaries when someone needs help." She slipped out before he could respond, but not before catching the surprised appreciation that flashed across his features, as if he wasn't accustomed to being truly seen or understood. As Eleanor walked back to the hotel through the gathering twilight, she found herself contemplating the enigma that was Sheriff Finn Newbury. There was a story there in his reserved manner, in his calm acceptance of pain, in the vigilance that never seemed to leave him even when wounded. A story she found herself increasingly curious to uncover, despite the warnings of her practical nature that such curiosity could lead to complications she wasn't prepared for. Summer gradually yielded to autumn in Montrose, bringing crisp mornings and golden afternoons that painted the surrounding mountains in breathtaking hues of amber and crimson. Eleanor had settled comfortably into her role at the clinic, earning the respect of the townspeople and the unwavering approval of Dr. Sullivan, who increasingly treated her as a colleague rather than an assistant. She had also, after much searching, secured a small cottage on the edge of town, a cozy 2-room dwelling with a front porch perfect for enjoying the magnificent Colorado sunsets. The move from the hotel had given her a sense of permanence, of truly belonging to Montrose rather than simply passing through. As for Sheriff Newbury, their relationship had evolved into something Eleanor couldn't quite define. Since the night she'd stitched his wound, a subtle shift had occurred, a lowering of guards, perhaps, or a mutual recognition of kindred spirits despite their different paths. Their interactions remained largely professional, but there was an undercurrent of warmth, of unspoken understanding that hadn't existed before. It was a crisp October morning when Dr. Sullivan called Eleanor into his office, his expression unusually serious. "I've received word from the mining camp at Blue Creek," he said without preamble. "They've got several men down with what sounds like influenza. Normally, I'd go myself, but Mrs. Thornton's time is near, and with her history of difficult deliveries, I dare not be away." Eleanor nodded, already mentally preparing a list of supplies she would need. "I can go, Doctor. I've handled influenza cases before." Dr. Sullivan's relief was palpable. "I was hoping you'd say that. It's a rough place, though mostly single men working the mines." "The camp supervisor, Mr. Hollister, is an old acquaintance who'll ensure you're treated with proper respect, but still." "You're concerned about propriety," Eleanor finished for him, understanding immediately. A single woman traveling to a mining camp alone would raise eyebrows even in the relatively relaxed social atmosphere of the frontier. "I was thinking perhaps Sheriff Newbury might escort you," Dr. Sullivan suggested, confirming her suspicion. "The journey's not without dangers, and his presence would silence any potential gossip." Eleanor hesitated. The thought of spending several days in Finn's company, away from the watchful eyes of Montrose, stirred emotions she wasn't entirely ready to examine. Yet the need was real and people were suffering. "Of course," she agreed. "When should we leave?" "Tomorrow at first light if the sheriff agrees." "It's about a day's ride each way, and you'll likely need to stay at least 2 or 3 days to treat the worst cases and establish quarantine procedures." Eleanor nodded. "I'll prepare the necessary supplies and speak to Sheriff Newbury this afternoon." She found Finn outside the general store, deep in conversation with a cattle rancher from the valley north of town. He excused himself when he spotted her approaching, his expression warming in a way that she'd come to realize was reserved for her alone. "Miss Thorne," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "What brings you this way? Not often we see you outside the clinic during working hours." Eleanor explained the situation at Blue Creek, watching his face carefully for his reaction to the request. Finn listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. "Blue Creek's pretty isolated," he said when she finished. "Trails rough in places, especially after the rain we had last week, but I can take you. Deputy Morris can handle things here for a few days." "I don't want to impose on your duties," Eleanor felt compelled to say, though she was relieved by his ready agreement. Finn's mouth quirked in that almost smile she had come to recognize. Keeping the peace in Montrose includes making sure our only nurse doesn't get ambushed by outlaws or wild animals on her way to help folks who need her. I'd say that falls squarely within my duties. Their eyes held for a moment, and Eleanor was struck again by how comfortable she felt in his presence, how the initial intimidation she'd felt around this quiet, capable man had gradually transformed into something much warmer. "Thank you, Sheriff. Dr. Sullivan suggested we leave at dawn tomorrow." "I'll collect you at first light," Finn confirmed. "Pack light but warm. Weather can turn quick in the mountains this time of year." Eleanor nodded her understanding. "I'll be ready." True to his word, Finn appeared at her cottage just as the eastern sky began to lighten the following morning. He rode Diablo, leading a sturdy bay mare equipped with a woman's side saddle. "Morning, Miss Thorne," he greeted her, dismounting to help with her bags. "This is Maple. She's gentle but sure-footed, best horse in the livery for mountain trails." Eleanor stroked the mare's velvety nose, immediately taking to the sweet-natured animal. "She's lovely. Thank you for arranging this." Finn secured Eleanor's medical supplies and small travel bag behind Maple's saddle, then helped her mount. The side saddle was familiar to Eleanor from her Boston days, though she had privately always found the convention ridiculous and impractical. "The trail narrows in places," Finn explained as they set out, the first golden rays of sunlight spilling over the eastern ridges. "Stay close, especially when we hit the pine forests. Easy to get turned around in there if you're not familiar with the terrain." They rode in comfortable silence as Montrose fell away behind them, the trail gradually ascending into the foothills. Eleanor found herself mesmerized by the landscape, the vast open spaces giving way to stands of aspen trees ablaze with autumn color, the distant peaks already dusted with early snow. As the morning warmed, Finn began pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of local knowledge: which plants were medicinal, which valleys held the best hunting, how to read weather patterns in the cloud formations. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed her quick intelligence and curiosity about this new world. "You've adapted well to frontier life," Finn observed during a brief rest to water the horses at a clear mountain stream. "Most Easterners take longer to find their footing." Eleanor smiled, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "I've always been adaptable. Much to my mother's dismay, she hoped I'd grow out of my unseemly independence, as she called it." "And did you grow out of it?" There was amusement in Finn's voice. "Clearly not," Eleanor replied with a small laugh. "Here I am, practicing medicine in the Colorado Territory, riding to mining camps, and generally scandalizing Boston society from afar." Finn studied her with those perceptive blue eyes. "You never did say what really brought you west. I'm guessing it wasn't just professional ambition." Eleanor hesitated, surprised by his directness. In the months she'd known him, Finn had never pried into her past, seeming to respect her privacy as carefully as he guarded his own. "No," she admitted finally. "It wasn't just that." She sighed, deciding that here, in the wilderness with only Finn to hear, she could speak the truth. "My father arranged a marriage for me to a business associate named Harold Winthrop. 53 years old, twice widowed, with adult children older than myself. A good match according to Boston standards." Finn's expression darkened. "And you didn't want this match." "I wanted to use my education to make a difference with my skills," Eleanor said simply. "Mr. Winthrop made it very clear that no wife of his would engage in something as unseemly as nursing. I was to be an ornament for his home, a hostess for his business dinners, and eventually a mother to his heirs." She looked down at her hands, remembering the moment she'd made her decision to flee. When I refused, my father threatened to cut me off entirely, so I took what savings I had, applied for the position with Dr. Sullivan, and left before they could stop me. Finn was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but intense. "You're the bravest woman I've ever met, Eleanor Thorne." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sunlight. "Brave or foolish," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "The jury's still out on that question." "Brave," Finn said with certainty. He rose from his position by the stream, offering his hand to help her up. "And Montrose is better for having you." Their eyes met as she stood, his hand warm around hers, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, a boundary crossed, a deeper understanding reached. For a breathless moment she thought he might say more, might even close the small distance between them. Instead, he released her hand and turned to check Maple's saddle. "We should keep moving. Still a fair distance to Blue Creek, and I'd like to arrive before dark." Eleanor nodded, gathering her composure. "Of course." As they continued their journey, the conversation flowed more easily, touching on everything from books they had read to their differing perspectives on the rapid changes sweeping across the West. Eleanor found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn out of her usual reserve by Finn's dry wit and thoughtful observations. By unspoken mutual consent, they avoided further discussion of their pasts, focusing instead on the present moment, on the stunning beauty of the landscape, on the simple pleasure of companionship without the constraints of town propriety. They reached Blue Creek mining camp as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. The camp was a collection of rough wooden structures clustered around the mine entrance, with a larger building that served as the company office and supervisor's quarters. Men moved between the buildings, many casting curious glances at the approaching riders. "Stay close," Finn murmured as they rode into the camp. "Most of these men are decent enough, but they haven't seen a woman in months, let alone one like you." Eleanor wasn't sure exactly what he meant by "one like you," but she understood the caution. She straightened her spine, adopting the professional demeanor that had served her well in the male-dominated medical wards of Boston. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard emerged from the main building, raising a hand in greeting. "Sheriff Newbury, Mr. Hollister said you might be coming with the nurse from Montrose." Finn dismounted, then helped Eleanor down from Maple. "This is Miss Eleanor Thorne," he introduced her. "Miss Thorne, this is Daniel Cooper, the camp foreman." Mr. Cooper touched his cap respectfully. "Madam, we're mighty grateful you've come. Got 8 men down with this sickness and more showing early signs. Mr. Hollister's among them, I'm afraid." "I'd like to see the patients immediately," Eleanor said, all business now that she was confronted with medical need. "Are they quarantined?" "Best we could manage," Cooper replied. "Put them in the bunkhouse at the far end of camp. Other men are doubling up elsewhere." "Good," Eleanor approved. "Sheriff Newbury, would you help me with my supplies? I'll need to assess the situation before dark." The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity as Eleanor examined each patient, confirming her suspicion of influenza and establishing a treatment protocol. The cases ranged from mild to severe, with 2 men, including Mr. Hollister, in particularly worrying condition. Finn stayed close, helping her organize medicines, fetching water, and generally making himself useful while maintaining a protective presence that kept the curious miners at a respectful distance. By the time darkness fell completely, Eleanor had done all she could for the moment. She emerged from the sickroom exhausted but satisfied that she had stabilized the worst cases. "You need rest," Finn said firmly, noticing her fatigue. Cooper's prepared a room for you in the office building. I'll bunk with the healthy miners and keep an eye on things." Eleanor was too tired to argue. She allowed him to escort her to the small but clean room that had been set aside for her use, grateful for his steady presence after the intensity of the past hours. "Thank you for your help today," she said as they reached her door. "I couldn't have managed nearly as efficiently without you." In the dim light of the oil lamp outside her room, Finn's expression was soft, unguarded in a way she rarely saw in town. "You're the one doing the real work here, Eleanor. I'm just following along in your wake." The use of her first name again, combined with the genuine admiration in his voice, sent a flutter through her chest that had no place in her carefully ordered world. She was a professional woman on a medical mission, not some swooning girl captivated by a handsome face and kind words. Yet as she bid him good night and closed the door behind her, Eleanor couldn't deny the truth that had been growing increasingly difficult to ignore. She was falling in love with the quiet, honorable sheriff of Montrose. The realization should have alarmed her. She had come west to escape one man's attempt to determine her future, to forge her own path based on her skills and intellect rather than her capacity for marriage and motherhood. Romantic entanglements had no place in the life she had envisioned for herself. But as she lay on the narrow cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mining camp settling for the night, Eleanor acknowledged that perhaps life had other plans for her, plans that might include both the medical career she had fought for and the unexpected gift of a man who valued her strength rather than seeking to diminish it. The next 3 days fell into a rhythm as Eleanor treated the sick miners, gradually seeing improvement in all but the most severe cases. Finn remained constantly at her side, helping with practical tasks during the day and standing guard outside the bunkhouse at night when she insisted on staying with the 2 critical patients. On the morning of the 4th day, Eleanor emerged from the sick room to find Finn waiting with a cup of hot coffee and a plate of beans and biscuits. "You need to eat," he said, guiding her to a bench outside the bunkhouse. "Can't help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." Eleanor accepted the food gratefully, realizing she had barely eaten in the past 24 hours. "Mr. Hollister's fever broke during the night," she told him between bites. "I think the worst is past for all of them now. We should be able to return to Montrose tomorrow if their improvement continues." Finn nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Cooper said to tell you they are all mighty grateful. These men aren't used to being cared for properly when sickness strikes. Usually just suffer through it and hope for the best. That's precisely why so many die from treatable conditions," Eleanor said with professional frustration. "Proper care makes all the difference, especially with influenza." "They won't forget it," Finn assured her. "Word will spread about what you did here." Eleanor smiled tiredly. "I'm simply doing what I was trained to do." "No," Finn said seriously. "You're doing far more than that. Most doctors wouldn't have come out here at all, let alone stayed by their patients' sides day and night." Before Eleanor could respond, a shout from the edge of camp caught their attention. A rider was approaching at speed, his horse lathered with exertion. Finn was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "Stay here," he told Eleanor, striding toward the incoming rider. Eleanor watched as Finn intercepted the horseman, engaging in brief, intense conversation. The rider gestured back the way he had come, his expression urgent even at a distance. Finn nodded grimly, then turned back toward Eleanor with purpose in his stride. "What is it?" she asked as he reached her. "Trouble," Finn replied tersely. "Riders from the Blackwater Ranch south of here. They've got a situation. Young ranch hand caught his leg in a trap meant for wolves. They can't move him and he's losing blood fast." Eleanor was already on her feet. "How far?" About 2 hours ride over rough country, Finn said. Eleanor, you're exhausted. You haven't slept properly in days. A man's life is at stake, she replied simply. I'll rest when we return to Montrose. The resignation in Finn's expression told her he'd expected no other response. I'll get the horses ready. Grab what supplies you might need. Within 20 minutes, they were riding hard along a narrow trail that wound through dense pine forests, following the Blackwater rider. Eleanor's body protested the punishing pace after days of minimal rest, but she forced herself to focus on the urgent medical need ahead, rather than her own discomfort. The Blackwater Ranch came into view shortly before noon, a collection of well-maintained buildings nestled in a valley protected by towering pines. Several anxious-looking ranch hands clustered outside a small cabin, moving aside quickly as Finn, Eleanor, and their guide approached. "In here, madam," one of the men said, leading her into the cabin. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight outside, and it took Eleanor's eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she had to steel herself against the grim sight before her. A young man, barely more than a boy, really lay on a rough-hewn table, his face gray with shock and pain. His right leg was a mangled mess below the knee, still partially caught in the vicious metal teeth of a wolf trap. Blood seeped steadily from multiple puncture wounds pooling on the floor beneath the table. "What's his name?" Eleanor asked, already opening her medical bag. "Jimmy Reeves," replied an older man with a weathered face and concerned eyes. "He's 17. Been with us 2 years now. Good kid, just got careless checking the trap lines." "Hello, Jimmy," Eleanor said gently, moving to the boy's side. "I'm Miss Thorne, a nurse from Montrose. I'm going to help you." The boy's pain-glazed eyes focused on her with effort. "Hurts something awful, madam." "I know," Eleanor said soothingly. "I'm going to give you something for the pain first, then take care of that leg." She turned to Finn, who had followed her inside. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and as much light as possible, and someone needs to hold him still when I remove the trap." Finn nodded, immediately taking charge of the preparations while Eleanor administered morphine from her medical bag. As the drug began to take effect, dulling Jimmy's expressions of pain to occasional whimpers, she carefully examined the trapped leg. The damage was severe, multiple compound fractures, torn muscles, and significant blood loss. In a city hospital, amputation would be the likely outcome. But here, miles from proper facilities and with only basic surgical tools, Eleanor took a deep breath, making her decision. She would try to save the leg. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "I'll need your help. This won't be pleasant." Finn moved to her side, rolling up his sleeves. "Tell me what to do." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor worked with single-minded focus, first carefully removing the trap, then cleaning, debriding, and setting the broken bones as best she could. Finn assisted with quiet competence, following her instructions precisely, providing an extra pair of hands exactly when needed without her having to ask. By the time she placed the final stitch and began bandaging the reconstructed limb, Eleanor was swaying slightly from exhaustion. The ranch hands, who had been watching in respectful silence, murmured in appreciation as she finally straightened. "The leg may yet need to come off," she cautioned the ranch foreman, "but there's a chance it will heal if infection doesn't set in. He'll need complete rest, regular cleaning of the wounds with carbolic solution, and fresh bandages daily." "We'll see to it, madam," the foreman promised solemnly. "Can't thank you enough for coming all this way." Eleanor nodded, suddenly too tired to form a proper response. She felt a strong hand at her elbow, steadying her. "Miss Thorne needs rest," Finn told the assembled men. "Is there somewhere she can lie down for a few hours before we start back to Blue Creek?" The foreman immediately offered his own cabin, insisting that Eleanor take as much time as she needed. Finn guided her there, his concern evident in the gentle way he supported her increasingly unsteady steps. "You pushed yourself too hard," he said softly as they reached the cabin door. Eleanor attempted a smile. Says the man who once refused morphine for a knife wound because he needed to keep his wits about him. Finn's expression softened. "Rest, Eleanor. I'll wake you in a few hours." She meant to protest that they should return to Blue Creek immediately, that her patience there needed her, but fatigue overcame her before she could form the words. The last thing she remembered was Finn's worried blue eyes watching over her as darkness claimed her consciousness.